The late 11th century was a world on a knife's edge. The great Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Shield of Christendom, was in deep trouble. Decades earlier, at the catastrophic Battle of Manzikert in 1071, the Seljuk Turks had shattered the imperial armies. In the chaos that followed, they swept across Anatolia, the empire's heartland. By 1095, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos was backed into a corner, ruling a shadow of his former empire. The Seljuks, a Turkic dynasty with roots in the Central Asian steppes, were now a formidable established power. They had founded the Sultanate of Rum, and its capital, Nicaea, was uncomfortably close to Constantinople itself. Desperate, Alexios sent a plea to the most powerful man in the West, Pope Urban II. He was asking for military aid, a force of elite Western mercenaries to help push the Turks back. But Urban saw a much bigger opportunity. Europe was a continent tearing itself apart, with knights and nobles fighting endless, bloody private wars. The Pope saw a way to channel all that violent energy outward, uniting the bickering factions of Christendom against a common foe. In November 1095, at the Council of Clermont in France, Pope Urban II gave a speech that would change the world. In front of a massive crowd, he spoke of the suffering of Eastern Christians and the desecration of the Holy Land. He called on the knights of the West to stop their pointless wars with each other. "Let those who have hitherto been robbers now become soldiers of Christ," he declared. And he offered a prize greater than any earthly treasure: forgiveness for all sins for anyone who took up the cause. Anyone who died on the journey, whether on land, at sea, or in battle, would be immediately forgiven. A cry then rose from the crowd, a phrase that would echo through the era: Deus vult. God wills it. The First Crusade had just begun. The Pope's call unleashed something no one could have predicted. It moved not just nobles, but people from every corner of society. An ill-equipped first wave, known as the People's Crusade, was quickly wiped out by the Turks, but that was just the warm-up act. The main event, the Prince's Crusade, was a colossal force of tens of thousands, including a core of perhaps 7,000 of Europe's finest knights. They were led by some of the most powerful and ambitious men of the age. You had Godfrey of Bouillon, a respected and devout duke, and his shrewd, opportunistic brother, Baldwin of Boulogne. There was the proud and powerful Raymond IV of Toulouse. And then there was Bohemund of Taranto, a Norman prince from southern Italy. Bohemund was a giant of a man, a hardened warrior, and a master tactician, driven as much by a hunger for land and glory as he was by faith. Waiting for them in Anatolia was the Seljuk Sultan, Kilij Arslan I. He was young, ambitious, and a brilliant commander of his Turkish horse archers. But having so easily crushed the peasant rabble of the People's Crusade, he made a fatal mistake. He dangerously underestimated the army now gathering in Constantinople. Thinking the threat was over, he turned his attention east to fight a rival Turkish dynasty. He left his capital, Nicaea, along with his family and his entire treasury, dangerously exposed. He was about to learn the difference between a mob of pilgrims and an army of ironclad European knights. In the spring of 1097, the Crusader army crossed the Bosporus into Asia Minor. First target, the Sultan's capital, Nicaea. By mid-May, the city was completely surrounded. Nicaea was a tough nut to crack, with high walls and a massive lake on its western side that allowed it to be resupplied by boat. The Crusaders, already low on food, settled in for a long siege. When news of the siege finally reached Kilij Arslan, he raced back, stunned by the sheer size of the army at his gates. On May 21st, he launched a furious assault on the Crusader lines. A brutal battle raged for hours, with heavy losses on both sides. But the Crusaders' heavy armor and disciplined lines held firm against the Turkish onslaught. Beaten back, the Sultan was forced to retreat, leaving his capital to its fate. Still, the siege dragged on. The Crusaders' biggest problem was the lake, which they couldn't blockade. This is where their uneasy ally, Emperor Alexios, made a brilliant move. He had a fleet of ships hauled overland on logs and launched them onto the lake, cutting off the city's last lifeline. When the Turkish garrison saw Byzantine flags on the water, their will to fight collapsed. But they didn't surrender to the Crusaders. Terrified of a massacre, they secretly negotiated with the Byzantines instead. On the morning of June 19th, the Crusaders woke up to see the emperor's flags flying from the city walls. Alexios's general had entered the city at dawn and accepted its surrender. The Crusaders were furious. They were forbidden from looting or even entering the city, except in small, escorted groups. Though the emperor paid them well, a deep seed of mistrust was planted between the Western knights and their Byzantine allies. Still, Nicaea was a huge victory. The first great city had fallen. Now, the real test began, the grueling march across the heart of Anatolia. On June 26, 1097, the Crusaders left Nicaea, their spirits soaring. One leader wrote home saying he expected to be in Jerusalem in 5 weeks. In reality, the journey would take 2 agonizing years. To make it easier to find food and water, the massive army split into 2 columns. A vanguard, led by Bohemund, marched a few days ahead of the main force under Godfrey and Raymond. And that decision? It almost got them all killed. As they pushed deeper into the Sultan's territory, the land grew harsh and dry. Kilij Arslan, burning for revenge, adopted a scorched earth strategy. He had everything in the Crusaders' path burned, poisoning wells and leaving nothing for the invaders. It was the middle of a brutal summer. Men and horses started dying from heat, thirst, and starvation. And all the while, the Sultan scouts shadowed their every move, just waiting for the right moment to strike. On the morning of July 1, 1097, near the ruins of Dorylaeum, Kilij Arslan sprang his trap. Bohemund's smaller force of about 10,000 men was marching through a valley when they were suddenly swarmed from all sides. The Sultan had gathered a huge army of horse archers who seemed to appear out of thin air, unleashing a storm of arrows on the completely surprised Crusaders. Panic ripped through the camp as the Turks rode in, cutting down non-combatants and foot soldiers. But Bohemund was a veteran commander. He reacted instantly, ordering his knights to form a tight defensive circle, their heavy armor a shield against the endless hail of arrows. But the arrows took a terrible toll on their horses. Bohemund knew they couldn't hold out for long. He sent desperate messengers galloping back to the main army, begging for help. For nearly 6 agonizing hours, his men endured the relentless attack. Just as their lines were starting to break, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. It was Godfrey's main force. The first 50 knights smashed into the Turkish flank, giving the exhausted defenders a surge of hope. Kilij Arslan was shocked. He thought he was fighting the entire Crusader army. Soon, more and more reinforcements poured onto the field. A separate force, led by the Pope's representative Bishop at Hema, swung wide and crashed into the rear of the Turkish army, right into their camp. Hit from the front and the back, the Turkish army, which had been moments from victory, suddenly broke and fled. It was a costly but decisive victory for the Crusaders. They had suffered thousands of casualties, but Kilij Arslan's army was scattered. The Crusaders had survived their first great test in open battle, proving their heavy cavalry could beat the lightning-fast tactics of the Turkish horse archers. The victory at Dorylaeum was a turning point. It broke the back of Seljuk power in western Anatolia and opened the road for the Crusaders. Kilij Arslan wouldn't be able to face them in a major battle again. The Crusaders also captured the Sultan's abandoned camp, and his treasury briefly solved their supply problems. But their journey was far from over. The march across the desolate plains of Anatolia was still an ordeal of starvation and death. And ahead lay another great obstacle, the massive, fortified city of Antioch. Its siege would pin them down for another brutal year. The ultimate goal, Jerusalem, was still 2 long years away. These first clashes set the tone for the rest of the crusade. It was a war defined by shocking brutality, clever tactics, and the powerful, often conflicting, motives of faith, greed, and personal glory. It was here, in the heat and dust of Anatolia, that the legends of men like Bohemund and Kilij Arslan were born, in an epic confrontation that would forever reshape the medieval world. The Siege of Nicaea and the Battle of Dorylaeum were the brutal opening acts of the First Crusade. They were a collision of 2 worlds, where armoured knights and mobile horse archers clashed in a struggle for the Holy Land. These costly early victories paved the way for the long march to Jerusalem, proving the Crusaders' incredible toughness while also revealing the cracks in their own alliances. The epic struggle had only just begun, setting the stage for centuries of conflict that would echo through history. If you love these stories about the epic conflicts that shaped our world, make sure you subscribe. And let us know in the comments which historical clash you want to see us cover next.